How long of a resume you want on that? Yeah, I mean, it's, for example, in the UK and in the US, it's an incredibly elitist world, but because, as I'm sure you guys know, and although still much higher in the US, we're going the same way. Education, in the vast majority, education worth having, at least for sure, in these two countries is mostly private, or it comes, or if it's not fully private, it comes at an incredible cost, right? Tuition fees, loans, etc., they are high. Meanwhile, in the rest of Europe, there are much more accessible and cheaper ways of accessing education. Believe it or not, this impacts the type of academics that you find. Now, the elitism in the UK and in the US comes because, well, it's perceived to be a prestigious thing. And therefore, to protect the capitalist system that just keeps on increasing and inflating those, fees, people like me, educating the public, are breaking the system. Because I'm giving you access to the knowledge that otherwise you would pay £12,000 a year for much more contained amount of money, right? In places like Spain or in European countries where education is mostly free, the elitism comes from an entirely different perspective. The vast majority of university jobs in many of these countries are often what we call or adjacent to civil servants, just like a state school teacher, which means it's a job guaranteed for life, which means it comes with a set of privileges, and it's a badge of honor, and it's a grind, and you work for the grind. The grind is what keeps you alive. So when someone else steps away from that, it's not a debunking of the system, because of course, in terms of the monetary value, so to speak, you're not impacting that, but you are taking the power away from the designed space where that power belongs, which is in a classroom, in a physical classroom, where that person has worked very hard to have their professorship or whatever. So it's essentially two sides of the same coin. And that is because overall, the world of academia, regardless, private, public, whatever, is incredibly elitist. And it has been designed through generations to be incredibly elitist. And particularly at a moment like what we're experiencing right now, where the humanities are directly under attack, this is the moment in time where we should be dropping all that elitism and making the humanities more popular than ever, right? Because if there is a clear demand, and I mean, this is just basic capitalism one-on-one. If there is a clear demand by ordinary members of the public to engage with this type of content, whether it's art or the Middle Ages overall, then there should be a justification as to why we should keep our academic departments about the humanities, the Middle Ages, and history open, right? So you could argue that the very role of a more public historian or a public archaeologist or whatever is precisely that way of giving you the entry level, so that then you can engage with it if you want in a more official way or whatever, to keep the art form preserved. But this is actually something that, and this is where the double-edged sword has become tricky in the world of public history. Do you know how many public historians on TV, perhaps many famous names that you probably would know, barely finish their history degree, don't even have a master's, don't even have a PhD, have never done any kind of postgraduate work, have never really done any actual research? Okay? No actual research. Many of whom went to, without wanting to point fingers, to prestigious institutions where they didn't really have to do anything, and they were just handed a degree at the end of the day because their families were so or so. Now, what is the problem when you put the education of the public in the hands of those people? That precisely the work of your professor becomes a failure, because a person that has dedicated themselves to the humanities, to the actual education of people, gets replaced by a, Disney Channel historian. And that is dangerous. Now, of course, this is not to say that there should be, one thing is just as bad as another. The reaction, of course, and the reason why these, let's say, TV historians became so popular was because, to be fair, academics were hanging on to the power for such a long time and so unfairly that the system had to break somewhere. But because the change didn't come from within, it opened up to a very dangerous situation. And of course, nowadays, in the world of social media, of TikTok, of YouTube, of cults of personality, rather than of knowledge and content and actual value, yeah, your professor would be considered academic detritus. And that's sad. And that's the reason why so many academics leave academia and start doing other things, myself included, because you end up trapping the system. You only are given a few options. Either you keep on running in the system, knowing that nothing is ever changed, and knowing that now you are part of the system. And in order to remain in the system, you need to behave the way that the system wants you to do. And therefore, you need to drop all kind of personal values that you may have to serve the system, or you break away. And it's very, very difficult to navigate, which is the reason why, the the very mission of medievalists as an institution, as a platform, is valuable, because what we all do here, and knowing Peter, like I've known him for a long time, and not just Peter, but many of the different people that contribute to this thing, um, this mostly came, from the academic outcasts, from the, okay, I've been rejected by the system or spit out by the system, whatever you want to call it. I'm not in the system anymore. But that doesn't necessarily mean that my voice doesn't have value, that my voice and my ability and my knowledge doesn't have use. Where does that use and value go to? Why isn't there a place for that? Which is, where the incredible work that goes into curating, by the way, in case you guys don't know, not just the courses, but every single piece of content that goes into the Medievalist website and everything else, it is very heavily curated, because it is curated by people who actually have that personal experience of the system without being within the system, which is, easier said than done. But that kind of due diligence doesn't necessarily happen everywhere. And while I am of the opinion that most people have good intentions when they are doing these kind of things, some people don't. For whatever reason, these people tend to be pretty successful, perhaps because their intentions are not so noble, and therefore they are quite happy making shrewd judgment to, change quality for profit. But this is something that we normally see best in popular media about history. You guys tell me how many TV shows, documentaries, books, whatever, you see of the exact same topic over and over every single year, as if it was the only topics that existed in history. Like,
Anne Boleyn.
yeah, right? That's the constant thing. And all of these issues, unfortunately, they are all linked with a lot of the things we've been talking about, which is, at the end of the day, all of these items of culture that we study and we value, they can be weaponized against us, sometimes even against our better judgment, because why go and tell you about the incredible, wonderful, amazing, I don't know, architecture that we have in Wales, when I can keep on showing you the same three sites around England? And I'm talking of a very, local situation, but the
Yeah.
same all over. And that's kind of where that subject unfortunately is. Incredible. Jake, I did recently decide to try out History Hit. Yeah, that's fair enough. But yeah, that's the other thing, Jake, and the reason why of course, is popular within a very specific. I generally mean this. History Hit overall and the podcast are genuinely designed to middle-aged, middle-class British women overall. No joke. And why that market specifically? Because they are still the only people overall that will be able to either have the disposable income to maintain subscribe, because the subscription is not particularly cheap either, or that because of precisely their age bracket and because of the country that Britain was after the Second World War, didn't necessarily have the ability to go to education in the way that they wanted to, or maybe they had to study careers that were a bit more pragmatic. But that's the reason why. And it is indeed incredibly Anglo-centric because, well, it's a little bit everything that we've been talking about today, because it is revival one-on-one once again in Britain, in the educational system in Britain. Me coming from Spain, I always thought this was nuts. I thought what we did in Spain was nuts. But when I came to the UK, I thought, well, that's just as bad from the opposite end of the spectrum. In Spain, from the age of 6, which is young, you start learning history from prehistory all the way up to pretty much the 20th century. Little kids normally don't make it past the Middle Ages because, of course, the pace is reduced. But as you start growing and as you go through, your middle school, your high school, etc., you do reach eventually the First, Second World War, and in Spain, not, although that is changing, the dictatorship, right? And I thought it was overkill because you don't really end up learning anything. You just kind of think this date takes you to this date and the other and the other and the other. I thought that was overkill and not particularly well structured. But at least every single Spanish kid gets through the, system learning a general timeline, so to speak, of Spanish history. In the opposite end of the spectrum, in the UK, there is very specific topics that you are taught. The Second World War, and often not even the Second World War from the point of view of the Allies, but Nazi Germany. The Empire, always, 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 always. Queen Victoria and the rest. The Tudors, because it's the building block to the Empire. And the Reformation, which explains why the whole country must be Anglican. The Middle Ages, but specifically 1066, the Norman conquest of England. God forbid that we actually taught the Anglo-Saxons or the Vikings in a reasonable way, which is the reason why the divide between the narrative of the country is so disparate. And if you get lucky, and it's a big if, you maybe get taught some British prehistory. So, normally with some field trips and whatnot, right? But there is no international history taught in this country of any kind, which to some extent makes sense. You need to learn the history of your own place and then associate it with the rest of the world. But it's pretty much the only country of Europe that I know that even at A levels or, high school doesn't teach something like universal history, European history, whatever. In high school, I took both Spanish history and universal history. I came to this country knowing more about the history of the UK than my British peers did because I had to study the whole timeline, if you see what I mean. Well, they only had this pigeonhole idea. And it's precisely that, the rehashing of the same subjects from an incredibly English centric view and eventually American centric view, because whether you like it or not, a lot of the history that is consumed in the United States that is not the history of the United States comes from Mother Britain. It's the biggest irony that I always tell people. This whole need to break away, and yet at the end of the day, the cultural connections run so deep that whether it's because of family history and roots or where did we come from, you end up coming to the same island, no matter how far away you try to run away from it. And it becomes all consuming. But another one of the reasons for it, and this is something that becomes problematic both in academia and specifically in popular culture, and when I mean popular culture, I mean the popular consumption of history, is that particularly after the Second World War, already since the 19th century, but particularly after the Second World War, it is United States historians and British historians, the ones that write international history. And as a result, everything is written in English and from an English perspective. whether it's the history of France, whether it's the history of Germany, it doesn't matter. It is very, I guess, shielded. And it makes sense if we consider that some of the best universities in the world are, of course, in the United States and in England. Sure, of course, there is going to be a particular heavy-handed, area involved in there. But it becomes a bit, you know, pigeonholed. It's the same way that the other day I was speaking with somebody in a tour from, I'm pretty confident they were from Rhode Island. And they told me, oh, because, our country doesn't have really history. And I was like, well, that's not true. Your country has a ton of history, a ton of history, literally. The problem is that in most cases, you are not really taught any history before the 1700s. Even the history of the Pilgrim Fathers and the original colonies of the United States is taught poorly and not in abundance in the United States, which baffles me, frankly, because, it's the foundation mythos and, and everything that you want. But there is a lot of history, whether you look at it from whether it is native history or otherwise. The problem that we often have is that we think history has to have been done entirely and purely by humans. And that's not true, because geology and geography and the climate and a bunch of other things are history too. And they've been happening in the United States, for an awful long time, for a really, really long time. So it's tricky. Oof, Texan moving to Virginia. I'm sure that was one hell of a change. But and in Texas, I feel that it's even more complicated because, of course, depending on what part of Texas you're from, you have even more ties to Spanish history or less ties to Spanish history, or more ties to Mexican history or less. And then of course, as soon as you get to the year 1800 something, the entire procedures of the American Civil War creates a narrative that makes it even difficult to find cohesion within the history of the United States, which is nuts. But it's because, once again, in the vast majority of our educational systems, history is presented to be something that doesn't have an actual purpose. And this ties back to the monuments, because we disrespect the subject as just boring knowledge that doesn't matter unless you want to know about history. It loses its meaning, it loses its value, and once it loses its meaning and its value, the way we teach it is completely dysfunctional. And that just creates a horrible feedback loop. And well, they teach it in one class, and yeah, but to be fair, if it's any consolation, genuinely it's the same here in the United Kingdom. I have many, many friends who are either primary school, middle school, or what we call A levels here, which is essentially senior high in the US, who, despite wanting to teach, because they are history majors or whatever, simply cannot, because the system is geared exactly that way to make you jump and put you in this particular pathway, which is, well, that's once again policy making. Because education, at the end of the day, this is the key. All of these things come from education. The more detached we are from what education means, which is the power and knowledge that people have on average, and with power and people, I mean ordinary people, not just the wealthy masses. Well, not even masses, they are not really masses, but the wealthy classes. That's where the root of all problem is. And that, in part, in my opinion, is because we lost the good way of education in the Middle Ages, where you had to learn your science, you had to learn your music, your letters, your history, in the same way that you had to learn Gregorian chanting and, and whatnot. Because, it was a more holistic approach to the world back then. Our desire with specialization and pigeonholing people to make them cogs in a system that needs cogs to keep on working has, in many ways, taken away, well, the values that our societies ought to have been and were built upon. But that's that is borderline history of philosophy and philosophy of the Western world, which I think probably is a topic for another day. I'm just gonna finish my cup properly speaking, but and any final thoughts, comments, questions, fire away. Otherwise, we'll start wrapping this up because it is getting close to dinner time, and I should probably actually have something to eat at a reasonable moment.